Quest for King Arthur, and I'm the King Arthur guy. This is episode 3. Now, you may remember that in the first episode, I said that I did not agree with the accepted reconstruction of the political system that the Britons are said to have used, but I wasn't going to make an issue out of it then. I was going to come back to it in a later episode. Well, this is that episode. Okay, so first you need to know the political system that everyone else has assigned to them. It's exactly the same system that the Anglo-Saxons are said to have used. Both peoples are said to have been politically divided into different kingdoms. It was every king for himself, all against all, and a king who could exert authority over at least some of the other kings would then become recognized as a high king. Now, just a note on the term high king, it comes from the Irish. The ancient Britons and medieval Welsh did not have a set title for the man at the top of the system. The Anglo-Saxons used Bretfolda, although there's no evidence that they were using it this far back. It first appears in the 8th century. There is no modern English equivalent of Bretfolda. So historians go with the Irish Ardri, or High King. Okay, now, everybody's noticed that there's a certain discrepancy between the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons. If you look at the period from 424 to 586, the Britons would have had at least 4 high kings, 5 if you include Arthur: Vortigern, Ambrosius Aurelianus, Arthur, Melwin, Run. Whereas in that same time period, the Anglo-Saxons would only have had 2, Ali of Sussex and Kelwin of Wessex. So this discrepancy is explained by saying that Vortigern and Ambrosius, and possibly Arthur as well, only had authority over the south. The problem is there's no good evidence to support that. Many of the northern dynasties claim descent from Cole Hen. So the argument runs that Cole Hen was able to keep the north united as one realm, while the south fragmented and Vortigern became High King. But there are people who argue that Cole Hen did not live in the 5th century. He was actually an officer in the Roman army in the 4th century. There are also people who argue that he never existed at all and was just a founding figure who was claimed as an illustrious ancestor. Now, that's the only evidence we have that some of these men only had authority over the south. I would argue there are other problems with this idea, starting with the fact that if you look at the origin of the establishment of these kingdoms, there's no real evidence that the south was politically divided until the 440s. However, Vortigern is said to have come to power in 424, over 15 years earlier. Then there's the fact that it is exactly the same system as the Anglo-Saxons. Political systems are usually a product of culture. I'm not really open to the idea that a Celtic people who'd been in the Roman Empire for approximately 370 years would have ended up with exactly the same political system as a Germanic people with virtually no Roman influences, unless there's hard evidence to back it up. And there is no hard evidence. On top of that, Brythonic kingdoms were significantly smaller than Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Each king had very limited resources and an awful lot of competition. So if they played every king for himself, we should expect them to have had fewer high kings than the Anglo-Saxons, not more. I'm going to illustrate this point with the kingdom of Gwynedd, because Melwin and Run both ruled Gwynedd, which is in northern Wales. So we can look at the position of Wales in the Middle Ages, where for much of medieval Welsh history, Gwynedd had a very difficult time trying to dominate the rest of Wales. Medieval Wales didn't necessarily have a high king. But in the time period of Melwin and Run, they weren't the Welsh yet. Melwin is, Gildas indicated that Melwin was a powerful king. Gildas wrote his book, The Ruin and Conquest of Britain, during Melwin's reign, and said that he, quote, deprived other kings of their lands and some even of their lives, clearly indicating Melwin had significant power. The most significant event of Run's reign is that he went to war with some northern kings and launched a campaign into the north in which most of the northern kings simply submitted. Only a few of them decided to fight, and Run was killed in battle in what is now southern Scotland. So, okay, now, even if we were to give the Anglo-Saxons as much territory as they could possibly have conquered, and I don't think they had conquered this much territory yet, exactly the same kingdom would have to have dominated all the rest of Wales, roughly half of what is now southern England, over half of northern England, and all of southern Scotland for almost 60 years. I would argue that that's physically impossible. If it could have done that, then it would have had absolutely no difficulty dominating Wales alone, and would certainly have united Wales into one realm. This kingdom is said to have gotten significantly weaker with absolutely no explanation as to how that's supposed to have happened. No, I think the evidence against the Britons doing the same thing as the Anglo-Saxons is much stronger than the evidence in its favor, especially since the evidence in its favor really doesn't amount to anything at all other than just assuming that it was the same. Now, I admit I couldn't figure out what the Britons were doing until I read a book called The Age of Arthur, which was written by a professional historian named John Morris and came out in 1973. I hasten to point out, this is a very controversial book. Morris made a number of bold assertions that he didn't really back up very well. One of those assertions was that the Britons actually had a central government. Now, I wasn't impressed with Morris's argument, but I did not dismiss the idea out of hand. I wanted to satisfy myself that there was hard evidence that he was wrong. But in setting out to do that, I ended up concluding that he was right. He just did a very bad job of explaining it. So he made three basic points. The first is that we know for a fact that not all of these men had the title of king. Magistrate is the only title we have for the rulers of Elmet, which is true. He also argued that the rulers of Dyfed sometimes used Roman military ranks. That's less clear, but we definitely have a magistrate anyway. Now, his next point is extremely important. He said that, like any other word, the meaning of the word king could change over time. And in the time period that we're talking about, it did not necessarily mean ruler of a kingdom. It could mean that, but it was a much more vague term for any high-ranking noble or a chieftain. He was right. I'm not going to go into all the evidence that I have for that. I'll just stick to one point. Modern historians will often use the term sub-king. According to the official definition, a sub-king was a man who had the title of king but did not rule his own kingdom. He ruled a region in someone else's kingdom. That's a noble. That's someone who in later centuries would have a title like duke or earl. Now, not only do we know that king was used as a title for noble, it's actually the only title we can verify for nobles in this time period. Take any other title, put it back into the context of the 5th century. It either didn't exist yet, such as earl or marquis, or it had a completely different meaning. Duke and count were both ranks of general in the Roman army. The only evidence we have that Britain fragmented into different kingdoms was that it had kings, but that doesn't prove it. His third point was that instead of looking at what the medieval Welsh did and projecting that back, we should look at what was going on in Roman Britain and move that forward. Okay? So the Romans never thoroughly Latinized the Britons. Some places had Roman-style society and therefore Roman-style administration, whereas others were still tribal, governed over by chieftains who were answerable to Roman officials. Officially, we don't know what title they used for these chieftains, but we're supposed to know that once Britain became independent, it divided into different kingdoms because it had kings. The Britons used two different titles for kings, vor and rix, with vor being more common. But doesn't it strike you as being odd that they supposedly had not one, but two titles that meant ruler of a kingdom when they'd never lived in kingdoms? And we don't know what title they had for their chieftains. Well, how about Vor and Rix? Now, the chieftains commanded the local militias of their areas. And they weren't just in charge of their training and leading them in battle. They also financed them. They paid for their weapons, their armor, their supplies and equipment. Now, as long as Britain was in the Roman Empire, that wasn't a big deal. But once Britain became independent, it would have been very easy for these chieftains to turn these militias into their own private armies. So everyone agrees that that's what happened, and everyone agrees that this is what led to Britain fragmenting into these different kingdoms. But did it? What if Britain still maintained some sort of central authority, and that these men were in fact nobles with their own private armies? So what would a central government under these conditions be like? Well, first of all, it would have been weak, given that the nobles could have defied the central government and could have waged their own wars, the same way that nobles would do during the feudal period of medieval Europe. What about the system of succession? It would not have operated on inheritance or primogeniture, because nobody was using that in Western Europe that far back. There are two different possibilities there. One is that they would have copied the Romans. In the Roman system, the emperor had to gain the support of the army and the approval of the Senate, at least in theory. In practice, the army was more important because it could bully the Senate. This made the system unstable because different units in the army could support different candidates. And coming to power was one thing, and holding on to it was something else. There were several times in Rome's history where they had several emperors in a row who didn't last very long. They also had a significant number of civil wars. This system, of course, would have required a standing army, and there's no evidence for that, and some sort of a senate. Gildas did mention the existence of a council, but he indicated that it was called just for a special purpose and was not a permanent body, so no help there. Now, it's generally agreed that these chieftains were chosen the same way that they were among the Irish, which is that they were elected by the leaders of the clan or of the tribe. All of the candidates had to have a blood claim on the throne, but they had a very broad definition of blood claim, and a man could have been succeeded by his second cousin. The more important the position, the more candidates would put themselves forward, the less likely it would be for a man to be succeeded by his own son. So whichever system they would have used, assuming that it was a central government, there would have been no discernible royal family. It's even possible that they started off with a more Roman-style system. This is what I think happened. They started off with a more Roman-style system, and then over time, it gradually became more Celtic. But anyway, so the system would have been weak central government and unstable. High kingship was weak because, of course, the kings had their own armies, and it was also unstable. Vassal kings often did not like being vassals. They did not like having their autonomy curtailed. They did not like having to pay tribute. So under those conditions, if this was a central government, it would look like high kingship. But would there be any way to tell if it was actually a central government? And I would argue, yes, it would. Now, the first piece of evidence comes from the Anglo-Saxons. Anglo-Saxon is an umbrella term for a variety of different Germanic peoples who came to Britain. The three most numerous were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Now, the Romans began hiring Anglo-Saxon mercenaries back in the days when Britain was still the Roman Empire. So there were some Anglo-Saxons in Britain, even at the time Britain became independent. And following standard procedure, most of them brought their families with them. Now, Vortigern significantly increased the number of Anglo-Saxon mercenaries. He hired the entire Jutish and Angle nations and resettled them in Britain. He treated them the way the Romans treated the Foederati, because Western Europe was in turmoil. This was an incredibly chaotic time period with all sorts of peoples battling each other. There was what was left of the Roman Empire, there was the the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Franks, the Alemanni, the Huns, and so on. So some of these people were just trying to get out of all of this chaos and find a place to live. So everyone agrees that Vortigern treated the Angles and Jutes as foederati. But I would argue the only way he could possibly have done that is if it was a central government. Because in order to settle them and give them land, he would have to have deposed kings. In fact, we are specifically told that he deposed the king of Kent. But a high king could not just depose a vassal king on a whim. He would have needed some sort of strong legal justification. And even then, in these examples we have in the history, the vassal kings would put up a fight. They were kings, after all. These were sovereign states. On top of that, once the vassal king was deposed, then the high king could not confiscate the territory and hand it over to a bunch of foreigners. He could try to ensure that his candidate was the successor, but he couldn't go beyond that. I would argue the only way that Vortigern could have done what he did is if the position of the administrator of these territories was appointed. So he could kick out the local governors and then hand the territory over to the Anglo-Saxons. Now, in the 19th century, there was an English historian named John Allen Giles who did a translation of the British history. And he included a footnote in which he said that the name of the King of Kent, who was deposed, may not have been a name, but might actually have been a term for a governor or a viceroy. So then there's the fact that Vortigern was deposed in a coup by Ambrosius Aurelianus. I would argue it was impossible to stage a coup in high kingship. The high kingship was an informal political system. It rested upon the resources at the high king's disposal and his own personal abilities and the reputation that he could create. Now, Ambrosius might have seized Vortigern's kingdom of Powys and gained control of those resources, but then he would still have to have used those resources through his own abilities to compel other kings to submit. But according to the information we have, he didn't even do that. Ambrosius did not take Powys. He went to someone named Cadale. Furthermore, Ambrosius obviously could not have usurped Vortigern's abilities and reputation. So killing Vortigern would not have compelled other kings to submit. It would only have killed Vortigern, and the position of High King would have died with him. Now I needed to test this hypothesis. So the medieval Welsh had high kingship for several centuries, the Anglo-Saxons had high kingship for several centuries, and the Irish are said to have had it for approximately 1,000 years. And as I said, the system was unstable. There are other examples of high kings being killed in battle, but I could not find any other examples of high kings being overthrown through coups. But you'd think that if it was possible, there would be other examples. I would argue that this is actually a central government, or was a central government, and it collapsed at some point. I'm not sure exactly when, but it was definitely still in place up until Brun's death in, as I said, 586. It is possible that it could have survived after that, because there were prominent Brittonic kings after that, taking it all the way up to the death of Cadwallader of Gwynedd, who would have died either in the 660s or the 680s, depending upon which source you want to use. But if they did rule a central government, it was a much weakened central government. But anyway, it definitely goes up to run. Okay. So that means this is another way of making the case Arthur was real. It's not a very satisfying way of making the case Arthur was real, because it turns into nothing but a placeholder, because you can't leave no one at the top of the system in the time period Arthur is said to have reigned, but it is a way of making the case Arthur was real. Now, I know this wasn't one of the more exciting episodes. So if you've hung on this long, I thank you. If you have not subscribed, I would ask you if you would do that, please. And give it a thumbs up if you liked it. And I hope you come back for the next episode where I'm going to start talking about my reconstruction of the history of Britain in the 5th century, where we're going to start getting into wars and coups and things will start getting more exciting. Okay. Until then, be seeing you.